Welcome to Touching Animal Stories. The Silent Language of Dust. Now I need to tell you about Dust. Not because he was remarkable in any conventional sense. Oh, quite the opposite. But because his very ordinariness made everything that followed so profoundly extraordinary. Dust was a horse. A chestnut mare. Once perhaps elegant, but now showing her age in the gray around her muzzle, and the slight swayback that spoke of years carrying more than just weight. She'd been roaming the abandoned Henderson farm since anyone could remember, appearing occasionally near the fence line but never close enough for anyone to catch her. There was something almost deliberate in the way she moved. Careful, aware of her surroundings, always positioned where she could see potential threats before they saw her. It made you wonder what she'd experienced in her life to make her so cautious. I'd tried to feed her a few times, leaving buckets of oats near the split-rail fence that separated the Henderson property from the coastal path, but she'd only come when no one was around, and even then, she'd eat quickly and disappear into the tall grasses that grew along the rocky shoreline. There was a quiet dignity to her movements, a certain grace that remained despite her obvious age and neglect. Her left hind leg bore a scar that curved like a crescent moon, and she favored it slightly when the weather turned damp, something the old-timers in town would sometimes mention when Dust was spotted limping along the cliffs. It was early September, the kind of morning when the Atlantic fog clung stubbornly to the Maine coastline, refusing to burn off even as the sun climbed higher in the sky. I was walking my usual route to the library. Yes, I'm the town librarian. Have been for 23 years. When I first noticed the pattern. Liam, Sarah's boy, walking home from school with his backpack dragging slightly behind him. And then, about 50 yards back, Dust. Not close enough to be threatening, mind you. Always maintaining that same distance, matching his pace, stopping when he stopped, turning when he turned. It was unsettling, really. In a town as small as ours, population 1,142 according to the last census, we're protective of our children, and the sight of a stray horse following a child who couldn't even call for help if he needed it, well, let's just say it raised eyebrows at the morning coffee clatch down at Maggie's diner. I remember the first time I saw it happen. I was arranging the back-to-school display in the library window. Yes, we have a school, a small one-room building that stood since 1981, when I noticed them through the glass. Liam trudging ahead, shoulders slumped in that way children have when they're lost in thought, and then, emerging from the mist like a ghost, Dust. Just there, watching. I stepped outside to speak with Sarah, who was waiting to pick Liam up. You know that horse has been following Liam, right? I asked gently, not wanting to alarm her. Sarah's face, usually so open and warm, closed off in a way I'd never seen before. Not fear or anger, but something deeper. Resignation, perhaps, or the weight of a secret too heavy to carry alone. She's not dangerous, Sarah said finally. If anything, it seems like she's looking out for him. I didn't know what to make of that, so I just nodded and went back inside. But the incident stayed with me, like a pebble in your shoe that you can't quite ignore. You see, Liam hadn't spoken a word in public since the accident. Not that anyone knew about the accident, of course. Sarah kept that to herself. But I'd pieced together bits and pieces over the months. A car crash the previous winter, Liam miraculously unharmed. Physically, but emotionally? Well, he'd stopped speaking. Selective mutism, the school counselor called it. Though I always thought that term sounded too clinical for what Liam was experiencing. He'd communicate with his mother through gestures, drawings, the occasional whispered word when they were alone, but in any public setting, he was silent as the grave. The town, being the town it was, had its theories. Mrs. Gable from the post office was convinced Liam was just shy, that he'd grow out of it. Old Man Henderson, no relation to the abandoned farm, though people always made the connection, claimed the boy had seen something he shouldn't have. The truth was probably much simpler. Trauma, pure and simple, manifesting in a way that made perfect sense to Liam but left the rest of us bewildered. Now, about Dust. The Henderson property had been vacant for nearly a decade, ever since old Mr. Henderson passed and his children decided the upkeep wasn't worth it. The barn was still standing, though leaning precariously to one side, and the pasture had grown wild with tall grasses and wildflowers. Dust had been there for years, according to some, though no one knew where she came from. Some said she was a former racehorse, escaped from a transport truck. Others claimed she'd been left behind when the Hendersons moved away. The truth, as is often the case with stray animals, was likely much less dramatic. Just a horse that had found a place to survive, making the best of whatever circumstances had brought her there. One afternoon, I witnessed something that made me reconsider everything I thought I knew about Dust. Liam was walking home from the library. He'd developed a fondness for the illustrated nature books, especially the ones about birds. When he suddenly stopped, his eyes losing focus, his small body going rigid. Just as he began to sway forward, Dust moved with a speed that belied her age, positioning herself against his side, preventing him from falling onto the rocky path. Sarah, who had been a few steps behind checking her phone for work messages, looked up just in time to see Liam steadying himself against the horse, who remained perfectly still, allowing him to use her as support until whatever had passed. When Liam's eyes cleared and he could move again, Dust retreated to her usual distance as if nothing had happened. I was sitting on the bench outside the library, pretending to read, but actually observing this strange dance between boy and horse. I saw the look of understanding on Sarah's face, the realization that Dust wasn't following them out of malice, but for some deep, instinctual purpose. I should mention that by this point, I'd begun spending more time with Sarah and Liam. Not formally, just small things. I'd save interesting seashells for Liam. Sarah would bring me homemade blueberry pie as thanks, and slowly, a friendship developed. One rainy afternoon when the library was closed and Sarah had the day off from her nursing job at the coastal clinic, she came by with Liam and finally told me the truth about her son's condition. It's called selective mutism, Sarah explained as Liam carefully arranged the seashells I'd collected on my coffee table. Most people have never heard of it. It's not that he can't speak, it's that his anxiety prevents him from doing so in certain situations. After the accident, well, his brain decided that silence was safer. She paused, watching her son, who was completely absorbed in his task, his small fingers tracing the spirals of the conch shells. The doctors still don't know exactly what triggers it. There are therapies, but they're not always effective. And the anxiety attacks, they're the most dangerous part. Silent, unpredictable, and he has no warning when they're coming. I thought of Dust, always at just the right distance, always alert when Liam seemed most vulnerable. And Dust? Sarah nodded. She senses them. Not all animals can do that, but some, usually those with specialized training, develop the ability to detect when something's wrong. I think Dust must have been trained for something like this. Whatever happened to her before she ended up here? We sat in silence for a moment, watching Liam. He looked up and smiled at us, a small, secret smile that seemed to say he understood more than he could express. But the town doesn't understand, I said finally. They see a stray horse getting too close to a child and think the worst. Sarah's expression was weary. I know, and I can't exactly go around telling everyone that my son has a rare anxiety disorder. That's not his story to have spread through town. No, I agreed, but there must be a way to make them see what we see. It was around this time that the town's concern about Dust began to escalate. Some of the more conservative residents started talking about having the animal removed. For the safety of our children, they said at the town meeting. I overheard Mrs. Gable telling Maggie at the diner that a loose horse is just one accident away from being a tragedy, and that we can't have wild animals roaming freely near our school children. One particularly tense afternoon, I was at the general store when Tom Jenkins walked in, face red with anger. That horse nearly caused an accident, he declared to anyone who would listen. Right outside the schoolyard. I was driving past minding my own business, and that horse came charging at me. I knew Tom well enough to be skeptical. What were you doing near the schoolyard at that hour? I asked. That's none of your business, Eleanor, he snapped. The point is, that horse is dangerous. Someone needs to have it put down before it hurts a child. Now I need to tell you about the day everything changed. It was late October, the kind of afternoon when the wind carried the first real bite of winter, and the sky was that peculiar shade of gray that Maine gets just before a storm hits. I was closing up the library when I saw Liam walking alone toward the cliffs. a rare occurrence as Sarah usually walked with him after school. I watched as Liam reached the edge of the cliff path, his small figure stark against the churning gray sea below. And then, as always, Dust appeared from the tall grasses, maintaining her usual distance. But something was different today. Dust wasn't just following. She was positioning herself between Liam and the cliff edge, her head lowered, her body language tense in a way I'd never seen before. Liam stopped walking and stood at the very edge of the path, looking down at the waves crashing against the rocks far below. His backpack slipped from his shoulder and landed in the grass with a soft thud. He took one step forward, then another toward the edge. My heart stopped. I started to run, but I knew I wouldn't reach him in time. The path was too long, the distance too great. And then Dust moved, not toward Liam, but between him and the cliff. She stepped deliberately into his path, lowering her head and making a soft, almost musical sound I'd never heard a horse make before. Liam stopped, his eyes focusing on Dust instead of the abyss below. I reached them just as Liam's shoulders began to shake with silent sobs. He turned away from the edge and buried his face in Dust's neck, his small hands gripping her mane. Dust stood perfectly still, allowing him this moment of connection, this safe harbor in whatever storm was raging inside him. Sarah arrived a few minutes later, having realized Liam had taken a different route home. When she saw them, the boy clinging to the horse providing silent comfort, she didn't say anything. She just nodded at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something else I couldn't quite name. That evening, Sarah called me. "It was a bad one today," she said quietly. "The anxiety, it was overwhelming him. He was having thoughts." Well, you saw where he was standing. I did see, and I understood why Dust had intervened the way she did. "The doctors have been talking about hospitalization," Sarah continued. "They think he needs more intensive therapy, but I don't know. I don't think he'd survive being separated from Dust." The truth came out then, not all at once, but in pieces. Sarah explained Liam's condition, how the anxiety attacks could come without warning, how Dust had been sensing them and protecting her son. I added what I knew about Dust's possible background, how some animals are trained to detect emotional distress. But the real turning point came a week later. The town council had scheduled a meeting to discuss what to do about the stray horse problem. I'd been dreading it, knowing that without intervention, they'd likely vote to have Dust removed. Or worse. That afternoon, as I was walking to the meeting, I saw Liam sitting by the old Henderson barn, Dust standing beside him, her head lowered as if listening to his silent words. I approached quietly and saw Liam's hands moving in small, deliberate gestures. Sign language, I realized with a start. He was communicating with Dust, telling her something only she could understand. I didn't interrupt. Instead, I watched as Dust responded with small nods of her head, gentle nudges with her nose, the kind of communication that transcends words. It was then I realized Dust wasn't just sensing Liam's anxiety, she was helping him find his voice again, just in a language the rest of us couldn't hear. The town meeting was packed. Nearly every seat was filled, and people were standing along the back wall. Tom Jenkins was there, of course, as was Mrs. Gable and several others who had been vocal about removing Dust. "The safety of our children must come first," Tom declared, standing at the podium. "That horse is a liability. It's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt." Sarah stood to speak next, and I could see how nervous she was. Her hands trembled slightly, and she kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting Liam to walk in. "I understand your concerns," she began, her voice steady despite her obvious anxiety. "But Dust isn't a threat. In fact, she's been helping my son in ways none of us could." She went on to explain Liam's condition, how Dust seemed to sense his anxiety attacks before they happened, how she'd positioned herself to prevent him from falling or walking into danger. "Yesterday," Sarah continued, her voice breaking slightly, "Dust kept my son from walking off the cliff. She stepped between him and the edge, made him focus on her instead of what he was thinking about." A murmur went through the room. People exchanged glances, some skeptical, others thoughtful. Then something unexpected happened. Liam walked in, leading Dust by a makeshift halter of rope. The room fell silent as the boy and the horse made their way to the front. Liam looked around at the gathered townspeople, his eyes wide but determined. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook, flipping to a page he'd prepared. With careful handwriting, the note read, "Dust saves me. Please don't take her away." Sarah translated for those who couldn't read the writing clearly. "He says dust saves him. Please don't take her away." I expected skepticism, maybe even ridicule, but what happened next surprised us all. One by one, people began to speak, not against Dust, but in favor of her. Maggie from the diner stood up. "I've seen them together. That horse is always where Liam needs her to be." Old man Henderson, who rarely spoke at meetings, added his voice. "My grandfather had a horse like that. Saved his life during the '38 hurricane." Even Tom Jenkins, after a long pause, said, "I suppose if the boy needs her, maybe we could find a way to keep her here safely." The vote was unanimous. Dust would be allowed to stay, with the town helping to fence a portion of the Henderson property to keep her safe and contained. But here's the part I didn't expect, the twist that no one saw coming. A week after the meeting, a man arrived in town, claiming to be Dust's original owner. He presented papers showing she'd been stolen from his therapeutic riding program in Vermont 3 years earlier. His name was Daniel Reeves, and he'd been searching for Dust ever since she disappeared. The town panicked. What if he took her away? What would happen to Liam? Sarah arranged a meeting at the library, inviting Daniel Reeves to explain his side. He was a quiet man in his 50s, with kind eyes and the hands of someone who'd worked with animals for most of his life. "I run a program for children with trauma and anxiety," Daniel explained. Dusty, she goes by Dusty in the program, was one of our most intuitive therapy horses. She had a special gift for sensing when children were in crisis. 3 years ago, someone broke into our barn and took several horses, including Dusty. We never found out why. He looked at Liam, who was sitting quietly beside Dust, his small hand resting on her neck. "I've been searching for her ever since, but I can see she's found where she's meant to be." The real surprise came next. Daniel didn't want to take Dust away. Instead, he offered to formalize her role as a therapy animal, to provide proper care and documentation, and to train other horses for children in our community who might need them. "It's what Dusty would want," he said with a smile. "She always chose her own path." And so Dust stayed, becoming the first officially recognized therapy animal in our town. The Henderson property was transformed into a small therapeutic riding space, with the town pitching in to repair the barn and fence the pasture. Liam began working with Daniel to develop his own communication skills, using both sign language and eventually, slowly, finding his voice again. The most remarkable change was in Liam himself. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, he began to speak. Not in full sentences at first, but single words, then phrases. Sarah told me later that the doctors believed the security Dust provided had reduced Liam's anxiety enough to help his brain rewire itself, to find pathways around the trauma that had silenced him. One clear October morning, about 3 months after Daniel's arrival, I was walking to the library when I saw Liam and Dust by the shore. Liam was pointing at something in the water, and for the first time since I'd known him, he spoke. "Look, Dust," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "A seal." Dust turned her head toward the water, then back to Liam, as if acknowledging what he'd seen. "I've always believed the ocean holds more secrets than any human could ever know. But I've come to realize that some secrets don't wash away with the tide. Sometimes they wash ashore, in the form of a horse with a scar like a crescent moon, and a silent boy who needed someone to understand his language. You know, I still see them most days. The boy and the horse walking along the cliff path, maintaining that same 50-yard distance that once caused so much concern. Only now, when Liam stops, Dust doesn't just stand there watching. She walks up beside him, lowers her head, and waits until he's ready to continue. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can hear him talking to her. Not in words exactly, but in a language that needs no translation. A soft hum, a gentle tap, the kind of communication that happens between two souls who've found exactly what the other needs, more than anyone ever knew.